There you go. It's green too. The Lord be with you. Welcome to our Good Friday service. It's an interesting time for us in this country right now. Over the next week and a half to 2 weeks, each state in this country will experience the peak of death from COVID-19 complications. Now, the good news is this is much earlier than was predicted. So what we're doing is working. Social distancing is working. But the sad reality is that as we gather to celebrate Holy Week and as we head towards Easter, we are surrounded quite literally by death. Now, this makes some people uncomfortable, but for Christians, we are able to sit in the midst of that because of the hope of the resurrection. So today, I invite you to walk with us as we follow Jesus' journey to the cross and sit in the midst of the death, acknowledge its reality, acknowledge its pain, acknowledge our own grief. Let's not rush to the empty tomb. Let us sit together for a while on Friday. It was 2 days before the Passover and the feast of the unleavened bread. The religious leaders and teachers of the law who collaborated with the Roman occupation were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. They had gathered in the place of Caiaphas, the high priest, who had received the high priesthood from the Roman government and retained the office under Pontius Pilate. They were planning to arrest and destroy Jesus quietly so as to avoid a popular revolt among the Jews.
At this time, Jesus was lodging at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. While he was there, a woman approached and anointed him with an alabaster jar of pure nard. When his disciples saw the act, they were outraged. "Why this waste?" they demanded. "Such costly ointment might have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." Jesus responded, "Why do you bother the woman? The poor are always with you, but I will not always be with you. Indeed, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will be told in her memory."
Then Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot and one of the 12, went to the religious leaders and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. When they heard the offer, they were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present.
Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." "Where do you want us to prepare for it?" they asked. He replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. Make preparations there." They left and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover.
When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God. After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, Take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom comes. And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed, but woe to that man who betrays him. They began to question among themselves which of them it might be who would do this. Then Judas slipped out into the night.
A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Jesus said to them, The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not like that, not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom.
Then Jesus said, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But Peter replied, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny that you know me 3 times. Still, Peter maintained, Even though I must die with you, I will never deny you. And so declared all the disciples.
Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, Stay here and keep watch with me. Pray that you will not fall into temptation. He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling on the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to his disciples, he found them asleep. Why are you sleeping? He asked them. Couldn't you keep watch with me for 1 hour? Look, the hour is near, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer.
While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the religious leaders, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders, all of whom had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? I was with you every day in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour, when darkness reigns." Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. And all of his disciples forsook him and fled.
Those who had seized Jesus brought him to Caiaphas, whom the Romans had made the high priest. Peter followed at a distance as far as the courtyard. There he sat with the attendants and warmed himself by the fire in the middle of the courtyard. A servant girl saw Peter seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But Peter denied it, saying, "Woman, I don't know him." A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly.
The high priest had gathered his whole council. They began to arrange the case against Jesus, which they would present to Pontius Pilate, the governor. The charge was that Jesus claimed to be king of the Jews, and they brought in many false witnesses, but to no avail. Finally, 2 came forward and testified, "We heard this man say, 'I will tear down this temple made with hands, and within 3 days build another not made with hands.'" The testimony was evidence that Jesus claimed an authority over temple affairs, which traditionally belonged only to the rulers of Israel. And in those days, Israel was ruled from Rome. Finally, Caiaphas stood up and examined Jesus directly. "Have you no answer to these charges?" demanded the high priest. Jesus remained silent and answered nothing. Then the high priest put the question of kingship in terms of the royal titles anointed and Son of God. "Are you the anointed one, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus answered, "I am. And you shall see the Son of Man seated on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." The high priest turned and said, "What need have we of witnesses? He has condemned himself." They all concurred that Jesus was indeed worthy of death for saying these things. Then those holding Jesus began to spit on him. They covered his face and were striking him as they taunted him and said, "O anointed one, prophesy who it is who is striking you."
At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the religious leaders and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." Jesus answered, "If I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the religious leaders and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." But they insisted, "He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here." On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time.
When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because he had been wanting to see Jesus for a long time. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The religious leaders and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked Jesus. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies.
Pilate called together the religious leaders, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." With one voice, they cried out, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the third time he spoke to them. "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I will have him punished and then release him." But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will.
The soldiers led Jesus away within the governor's palace. There they assembled the whole battalion. They clothed Jesus in royal purple. They set a crown of thorns upon his head and shoved a reed between his fingers for a scepter. They began to mock him by kneeling before him and proclaiming, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They also spat upon him and struck him on the head with a stick. Then after mocking him, they took away the purple, returned his own clothes, and brought him out to crucify him.
As the soldiers led him out to crucify him, they seized Simon of Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed Jesus, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others, let him save himself if he's God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there with Jesus hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last.
The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, "Surely this was a righteous man." When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things.
When my son was little, like one and a half, 2, he would sit like this. That's just how he would sit. Wherever he was, in the middle of the floor, in the middle of the living room, in his playroom, you would call his name, and he would turn and look like this, and turn and look like this. That was his position. When my wife would pick him up and carry him around, this is how he was. And he was so open. People would call his name in the grocery store, at church, or wherever we happened to be, and he would turn, and he would smile, and he was so open to the world, to everyone. And I remember saying to my wife, it's going to kill me the day that he learns to do this. Because that'll be the day that he learns that the world is a painful place, that the world can hurt us. I know many adults who, though not physically going through the world like this, emotionally they do. They were hurt by the world and never got over it. And so they're closed off from others, from relationships, from opportunities. They have decided that they are not going to let themselves be hurt. All throughout the scriptures, we are told that the disobedience of God's people hurts God. We are told that God suffers because of his people, and that God suffers with his people. And yet, God never turns his back on us. Never. And that's why, on that day, God hung on the cross like this, to tell the world, I am and always will be open to you. I will never stop loving you, no matter how much you hurt me. I will never choose to turn my back on you, no matter how painful our relationship may be. Jesus hung on the cross like this so that we would know we were loved. On this Friday, in the midst of everything going on, know that you are loved. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.